Newsrooms covering the United States presidential election have been given a stark warning: prepare for the election to go off the rails. That's the message from Jennifer Brandel, the former CEO and founder of Hearken, a tech-enabled company based in Chicago that has created online tools to assist journalists who are covering a poll described by both campaigns as the most important election in generations. In a conversation with the SABC's Sherwin Bryce-Pease, Brandel explains some of the scenarios that could lead to post-election violence, including delays in declaring a winner due to a surge in voter turnout and the use of mail-in voting as a result of the coronavirus pandemic.
So you penned this article, Newsrooms Prepare for the Election to Go Off the Rails. When I saw this, I thought, my goodness, I feel this too. There's a palpable sense that all is not well in the United States, and absolutely nothing seems clear or certain as we head towards this election. Give us the thrust of your argument and why you felt the need to pen this.
I felt the need to write it so plainly because for the last many months, since May really, we've been trying to sound the alarms with this initiative called Election SOS, which is designed to help newsrooms prepare for threats that have never been encountered before or are being encountered again in new ways since 2016. And I kept on encountering newsrooms who really weren't taking some of these threats seriously, especially the threat of political violence, where we know if that happens, I mean, forget about all the other great things we need to figure out around counting the vote and seeing what happens, but that is going to throw everything off the rails. So I just felt like I needed to put it in more plain language because they were not responding to the alarms that we had been putting out.
I mean, the country is so very divided, right? Cities versus rural, blue states versus red states, Trump versus Biden, conservative judges versus liberal judges, masks versus no masks, my way or the highway. Is the fundamental notion of democracy under threat in the United States?
I believe so. I do believe so. I think that forces have been conspiring. Many have been conspiring in order to divide the country and pin us against each other. It's a really great strategy for destabilizing the country, which it has worked very well, is to, instead of people who are feeling unsatisfied or like they don't get their basic needs met through government and other social services, to start looking at one another as the problem and not some of these bigger systemic issues, which are harder to wrap your head around and frankly take a long time to change. So I think it's an immediate way of finding some release, is finding a villain on the other side, whatever that side is.
Who's driving this division, do you think?
Well, I can't wait to see the documentaries that come out in 5 years, looking back at what happened now when people are free to speak. But, I think there's a lot of that happening, obviously, with the conservative movement in the U.S. I think they know that if everyone in the U.S. did have their right to vote, conservatism and the Republican Party would probably no longer be a thing. It would be severely under threat. And then there's also other forces, foreign forces such as Russia, that, can gain a lot from destabilizing the country. So I think there's a lot of different forces at play. And our president, Donald Trump, is, Mr. Divider in Chief. So he's a lot to do with this.
Is this also a conversation, Jennifer, about values and the fact that increasingly Americans don't appear to share the same values, not even around human life and the devastating toll that we've seen as a result of COVID-19 in this country? That is what the narrative appears to be, and it's now been permeated in large sections of society. The mask conversation, the rallies that you see at Trump events as opposed to Biden events. I mean, the value system seems to be quite different, and perhaps the essence of the problem here.
I think the values at the end of the day are actually very much overlapping. I think what we've been, everyone wants a safe community to raise their families in. They want to be able to have jobs. They want to have some security. Everyone at the end of the day has the same basic needs they want to get met. I think what we've been, unfortunately, changed by is these loud narratives coming from people in power, pinning us against one another and making it seem like you need to pick sides like a sports team in order order to, find some camaraderie and allegiance. And COVID-19, of course, has exacerbated everything because we're not able to be in person with each other. We're not able to have those conversations as easily with people we might not agree with. And obviously, social media keeps us in our bubbles even more so than we are right now by being, distanced from one another. So I do think our values at the end of the day are very, very similar. And I think there's so much more nuance between those extremes, but those easy narratives that we go to of good and evil, and which side are you on, is just a human nature. We start getting indoctrinated since children of who's the bad guy. So I think we need to really embrace complexity and nuance, and we can find that our values are very much aligned.
So you've said in this article that you're alarmed at how unalarmed newsrooms are for a worst case scenario, how unalarmed they are about the threats. And yet there are so many who say it's the media who are the alarmists at the best of times. Explain why, how their posture should be different in your view.
Well, a lot of this is driven by the business model of media, and in the US and like many countries, there's for-profit, nonprofit media, and there are different incentives for creating the types of stories that get people more emotional and get them to click or share and read. And what we find is that because of the economic turmoil that's been going on in the US in particular, in terms of our publishing and news media industry, publishers are desperate to get more advertising money and to get more people on their sites. And so that does encourage some of these really divisive and juicy kind of headlines that aren't as nuanced and that do kind of slant what the actual truth is. So I think a lot of it is driven by the underlying business model in terms of making news that is spicier than it really is at the end of the day. Not to say there's not enough going on right now that's intense.
Right. So you list in the article a number of examples of what you mean by going off the rails. Do you mind just sharing a couple of those examples? Because the list is long.
The list is long. I mean, at the end of the day, the things that we are seeing so much evidence for happening, and let's hope they don't, it just feels like there are powder kegs everywhere and matches being flicked in every direction. So there's misinformation and disinformation, which has been with us for a long time, but will be highly leveraged by bad actors in the coming weeks. There's also the fact that mail-in ballots, every state is different in terms of counting them. So we're not going to know the results, likely for the presidential and other races, key races, for a while to come. And when there is that ambiguity, and we've been ratcheting up this tension for so long, it allows either side to claim victory or to start to incentivize their supporters to go out and protest. And we know that with armed, unlawful militia activities, these self-organized groups that are taking it upon themselves to protect, who knows what, they are going to ratchet up the tensions quite a bit. And we're seeing that already. So, armed conflict, unknown results, stock market tumbling as we see COVID and investors getting nervous because the instability in the country, all of these things are just going to make all of our lives much more anxious and much more able to have a small spark light a big fire.
Just look at my face as it kind of went from smiling to not so smiling.
I feel that.
We're already seeing reports that luxury apartment buildings and businesses in New York are hiring extra security due to concerns about post-election violence. Washington, New York, Chicago, where you are, Los Angeles, among others, where businesses are boarding up their windows in anticipation of some chaos. Delays, as you mentioned, in results are increasing the likely, based on the high volumes of mail-in and absentee ballots. So, does election night present some sort of precipice here?
I believe so. I think there's still so many people who believe in their hearts that we're going to know an answer, that it's going to be clear. And even if the results do show something that ends up being true at the end of the day in terms of a clear victor, the path to that being the narrative that is true and cleared in the courts, in public opinion, after all the votes are counted, is going to be a long and treacherous road. So I am glad to see that businesses and others are taking precautions, because you would much rather be safe than sorry here, and there's so much at stake.
Talk a bit, just as we sort of wrap here, about the resource that you've created, Election SOS, to support journalists covering the election. What does Election SOS provide them with specifically?
Yeah. Well, starting in about May, we were doing a lot of proactive work. So with newsrooms that were thinking, we want to change our coverage and how we approached elections and political coverage from 2016. So let's start to do that. So we had some training that was really specific about doing behavioral change in newsrooms, engaging the public more, showing your sources, why you're trustworthy, et cetera. But as of the last 3 months, we've really flipped to the reactive switch because journalists and newsrooms do not have the time to start thinking high level. They are all about reacting. And I mean, compounding this whole political moment and the pandemic is also the fact that the U.S. is dealing with a lot of climate crises, including wildfires, hurricanes, tornadoes, earthquakes, you name it. So there's no shortage of just emergencies. So what we're trying to do is give journalists as quick access as possible to the information, whether that's checklists or people who are experts in voter suppression or people who are experts in how to de-escalate violence, what they need to prepare for. So we have scenario planning guides, tons of resources and webinars, just to give journalists that extra training that their newsrooms can't offer them right now.
So, final question for you. Should newsrooms be sending their war correspondents to the United States?
I don't think that would hurt. I think having combat readiness and understanding the volatility of those situations is really important. The other thing I think newsrooms need to take into account right now is who they're sending out to do these stories and what risks that they are posed. If people of color are out there in the midst of a rally in which there's a lot of white supremacy, that puts them at even more danger. So it's difficult with understaffed newsrooms to already figure out how to be on the ground. And they're going to rely on freelancers a lot, and freelancers are among the most vulnerable because they don't have insurance and they're not guaranteed to get paid. So it's going to be interesting to see who goes out and how they do. But I hope they've trained, they have protection, they have lawyers to call, and they have a good plan in the newsroom in case things go awry.
Well, I'll do this.
Thank
Jennifer,
you.
Thanks. Really important insights, and thanks so much for writing that piece and sharing your insights with us.
I'm back here at